The 130th Marine Brigade had orders to join them in the desert. It was the only failure of the whole operation. The Israelis shot down 14 loaded helicopters, and the survivors achieved little. The Egyptian generals had estimated they would lose 10,000 men in crossing the canal alone. In fact, the barrage kept most Israelis in their bunkers. And throughout this most dangerous Third Army poured more men into the Sinai. In imitation of Israeli tactics, heli-borne troops had been dropped behind the lines. Further south on the Bitter Lakes, an amphibious operation was underway. Tanks and troop carriers brigades, after the initial shock, were now fighting back. Designated teams began clearing the Israeli defences, where the Jerusalem were doing training. It wrought havoc among the Israeli tanks. One unit alone claimed 8 tanks in the first 10 minutes. With the tank defence now in place and heavier equipment arriving, the second phase of the operation could begin. And the latest Soviet anti-tank missile, the Saga. Unfolded from a suitcase, it could be set up in minutes. Its wire guidance system and 3,000-yard range demanded courage and skill from the operators. Each had fired 100 rockets. Once the first wave had scaled the bank and established a foothold, tank hunting units moved inland to await the first Israeli armour, equipped with RPG-7 anti-tank weapons. And turning it into a wall of flame. The Egyptians took no chances. The night before, frogmen had blocked pipes leading down to the canal. 8,000 Egyptian infantry began crossing the canal in rubber dinghies at midpoints between the forts. In 1971, the Israelis had tested a method of pouring oil onto the canal from an underground system, West Bank and the canal in smoke. Screened from Israeli eyes for the cameras. Hundreds of machines read that months later, their Third Army reenacted the whole exercise. The Egyptians were so proud of it, saw Arab military credibility. The tanks joined 1,000 other guns, pouring tons of high explosive onto the Bar-Lev line, while an airstrike hit Israeli positions deep in Sinai. It was the start of a technically brilliant operation that would risk Jerusalem Brigade doing their annual military service. They found out what the construction work was for at 2 p.m. on the 6th. Tank ramps now overlooked their positions. Boredom. But like the exercises, it was just one part of the meticulous planning that would make the canal crossing an epic military achievement. In October, the Bar-Lev forts were manned by reservists for months, and even fresh construction work was thought to be an attempt to stave off. Bar-Lev forts had grown complacent too. Egyptian exercises had been a regular event now, up to 60 feet high in places. Ample time, he thought, for the forts along the Bar-Lev line to be supported by the armour reserve, waiting further back in Sinai. The 600 men manning the Syrian and Egyptian forces, he negotiated with the Russians for the military hardware they would need. He shared the planning with his chief of staff, General Saad el-Shazli, a popular hero figure who had led paratroops in Sinai in '67 and was one of the few Egyptian officers to emerge with credit. He rid the Egyptian officer corps of its Cairo playboy image and instigated rigorous training. His preparations omitted nothing. He even studied old records of the Suez Canal Company to check tidal conditions. In the middle of the war, he opposed Sadat over the role of the armoured reserve at a crucial point and was quietly dismissed. On the Israeli side, the Defence Minister Moshe Dayan was a powerful personality who had dominated Israeli military affairs for years. His courage and flair were amply demonstrated during the Sinai campaign of 1956. But this time he failed to live up to expectation. From the start, he was torn by doubt and unwilling to take responsibility for vital military decisions. He was heavily criticized for Israel's lack of preparation after the war. General Dayan described the Suez Canal as the best anti-tank ditch in the world. He calculated it would take 24 hours to bridge it and cut through the sandbanks the Israelis had built all along the coast. General Ahmed Ismail, the Egyptian war minister, was appointed to overall command of both help. He shared his plan with Syria's President Assad, who also obtained Soviet SAM missiles to cover the Golan battlefield. They agreed a timetable for a coordinated attack when Israel would be least prepared. Believed it would be 1975 before Arab air power was strong enough to contemplate another war. However, the sheer scale of the Arab defeat put tremendous domestic pressure on the Arab leaders to try again. Syria's Golan Heights, the West Bank of Jordan, and the entire Egyptian Sinai Peninsula were a constant reminder of the humiliation of 1967. King Hussein, having lost half of Jordan to the Israelis, could not afford another direct clash. But for the new presidents now in power in both Damascus and Cairo, it was a risk they felt compelled to take. Israel still had less than half the number of men, tanks and planes, and a fraction of the missiles that Egypt and Syria could field against them. Those forces would have to cover two fronts, a further handicap for Israel. At the end of the 67 war, the Egyptians had been driven out of Sinai and had concentrated on defending the west bank of the Suez Canal. The Israelis knew from experience that the key to the desert lay in the passes that crossed through a mountainous ridge beyond their headquarters at Bir Gifgafa. They constructed a defensive line along the east bank of the canal named after General Bar-Lev, and a series of forts were built along it. Tanks would move to prepared positions between them during an alarm. To counter Israeli air raids during the War of Attrition, the Egyptians built up one of the world's densest missile walls, creating an anti-aircraft umbrella over the whole Suez area. President Sadat realized that even without a comparable air force, he could fight a limited war under that umbrella, cross the canal, gain a foothold in Sinai, and then negotiate with Russian up the combined Arab air forces. The impact of total air supremacy had transformed the course of the war on the ground. Most Israeli military thinking since had been based on the belief that the Arabs would never again risk a major attack without being able to compete in the air. They believed in those first 3 hours of the 5th of June, in which the Israeli Air Force virtually wiped out. The answer lay in the stunning Israeli victory of 1967. The key factor had they were operated by highly trained Arab infantry who bore no resemblance to the soldiers routed in 56 and 67. The question all Israelis asked that day was why were they so ill prepared? The superiority of the Israeli Air Force, hindering their attempts to carry out ground support roles in the first hours of the war. And on the ground, the apparently invincible Israeli armor came up against a new generation of anti-tank missiles. High-tech Soviet missile systems challenged the now established super warfare. It was a war in which the latest military technology overturned conventional tactics. It transformed the theories of modern death, and then engaged them in the biggest and bitterest tank battles since the Second World War. In particular, the Egyptians, who fought their way across the Suez Canal with spectacular success. This time they learnt to respect the courage and fighting abilities of the Arab armies. Syrian and Egyptian forces 10 times greater than their own. The holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Israel's border troops, below strength during the holiday, came under surprise attack by Saturday the 6th of October 1973, Yom Kippur.